only a few chips to this one with the D. Almost everybody, right? There's one, another one. Do you have another thing? Okay. On the Moodle, there are only like 6 people, not including me, that are registered, so I'm not sure what's going to happen. It's going to affect a little bit our plan. So after you finish up filling up the registry, I will kind of know a little bit more. Second thing I want to know is to say that I forgot my charger, so I'm not trying to out the battery. I hope it will not happen before the break. Yeah, do you have one on? Okay, so for now, if it breaks, okay. So, first of all, if you don't know me, I'm in Trinity, London. I'm PI here in life science and in ELSA. I have a lab downstairs in Silverman. That's the room number. You can always contact me through email or through my phone at the office. And the office hour it's on Wednesday, usually 4 to 5. But please call me first before you arrive unexpectedly. I mean, it's not a problem if you do, but I might not be there. Okay. What the course about? So this is more or less the plan of the course. I put it on Moodle. It's not there yet. And there are something like 28 lectures. In the middle we have 2 breaks. One because we have a meeting, an LSEC meeting, which starts I think on the 11th of December, but runs through the 12th, and I encourage all of you to come because they're going to be good talks there. I'm not sure. I think it's not happening here, but in Mishkenot Shanani, like the previous L2 conference. And like towards the end of the semester, there's a special one-off conference called Frontiers in Synaptic Function, which is organized by Dan Segev and Micha Spira. This is in memory of Yitzhak Parnas, who used to be a professor here, actually one of the founders of the Department of Neurobiology. And it's going to be an excellent conference. And it's a bit lucky because we're not going to cover almost any synaptic physiology in this course, so this would be a very good chance to learn some more advanced stuff about that. This was the topic that Yitzhak Parnas was studying for all of his career, so they focused the conference on that. And there are going to be, if I'm not mistaken, 4 Nobel laureates coming to talk there. So it's going to be really good. I mean, one of them is, I don't remember the name, but just for the number, he was decided before he was going to be a Nobel laureate. But he was just announced last week. So this is going to be very good. So we're going to miss 2 classes. Most of this course is about the motor system. So the course, like last semester, like the first part, there are many guest speakers who are experts in some of the subjects. And most of the course is actually surrounded around the motor system. So some of the schedule is a bit tricky because we had to coordinate all the times with all the speakers. And I made an effort to compress all the non-motor stuff into the beginning. And there are a few points later on that will kind of we'll have to thought would be interesting and important, and it wouldn't be a full course in physiology of the nervous system if we don't cover them. So some of them are here in the beginning. We're going to talk about the autonomic system today. There will be 2 lectures of the development of the nervous system. There will be one talk about glia and the hippocampus. And this talk is optional about emotional brain, amygdala, and other stuff. I put it here, but we might actually have to change that, so I don't know. The rest is dedicated to the motor system, and some of it will be given by me, some by Ifat Wood, some by a guest lecturer from Scotland, from Edinburgh, Ian, who's coming specially to give these 2 talks, and another talk with Elsa about the motor cortex. And there are some, and the basal ganglia will be covered by Sergei Bergman. Some of the talks are advanced talks. So, for example, on every subject, almost every subject, we have an advanced talk. So, for the motor cortex, we have Elon will give us a talk about advanced talk about the motor cortex. Basal ganglia, I think we're not going to have that because Sergei is an expert. We have like 2 other guests which give you some more computational aspects about motor control. That's what I wanted to say about that. By the way, if you have questions, just ask me.
I just wanted to say that on December 17th, I think there is the House of Ends group for most of the IT people in here.
Most of IT people? What do you mean? Are you going to SFN? Okay. So, I mean, this is not, that's the next thing that I'm going to talk about, which is like last semester, we're going to have sessions with presentation of papers. I planned 6 of them because I thought we're going to be 12 people. I don't know, after we have the list, we can change that and see if we have more or less. But basically, I try to have some gap between every subject and that presentation, which means that we're only starting with that on the 5th week with the hippocampus, and then we have one on spinal cord, on the cerebellum, motor cortex, basal ganglia, and lastly, I decided that we'll have one session for the brave ones, which will be independent, so it will be on papers that on other subjects that we're not going to cover in class, but it will at least give us some chance to get exposed to some of them. So this will be on disease, I haven't chosen that yet, but it will be Alzheimer or ALS or something strong with it, but not too many of them anyway. So 17th, I don't know, we'll see what we can do. And if people miss these classes, we'll deal with that separately. Okay. Okay, so as I said, what happened to the glossy? As I said, the physiology of the nervous system is an obviously impossible subject. And there are many things that we're going to drop, and some of them are big. We're not going to talk about synaptic physiology except for that conference. We are almost not dealing at all with any chemistry, if you want, like neurotransmitter, neuromodulation, anything that has to do with that, the hormones, we're going completely to ignore, almost. We're not going to talk about the thalamus. We're not going to talk about specific aspects of the motor system, like what control your posture, what can control your vestibular behavior, what control the way you hold your gaze at one point or like subtopics, for example, like epilepsy is connected mainly to the hippocampus, so we're going to talk about that a little bit. But many of those we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about sleep, and we're almost not going to talk at all about higher processes like language, like memory, which are obviously today, and not only today, have a lot of, in a way, these are the reasons why we study the brain, or at least some of the reasons, but we're not going to get there. So just in a way, we try to give an overview and the concept, and to give you the tool to work it out yourself later on. In some cases, in many of the cases, I feel sometimes that what we spend the time in class is actually not what we should do, because a lot of that you could read yourself in the textbook. But we know ourselves, and we know that if we make it that way, it will not happen. It's not to the level that we want. So I'm starting. This is the first time I'm giving this course, but with time, I'm sure this is going to later years. I think there will be a shift towards reading more and discussing more in class other stuff. Now I'm going to go to a point that I had a lot of, wasn't like obvious for me to decide whether I'm going to do that or not. So some time ago, I watched this TED Talk, and I thought this is something that should seem to happen. And yesterday, I think, or the day before, I got an email from the president of the university, encouraged us to talk about what is academia and why are we here and what are we doing here and that. And there are very little chances to do that, in fact, and I thought this would be actually a good opportunity, although we have to pay by learning a little bit less on the automatic system. And I'm going to steal 18 minutes of your time. I would have done that myself, but this guy is just doing it so well, much better than I can do that. So let's just try to do that, and just hope it will work actually. Okay. Did expect that to happen. Just give it another chance.
There is an ancient proverb that says, it's very difficult to find a black cat in a dark room, especially when there is no cat. I find this a particularly apt description of science and how science works. Bumbling around in a dark room, bumping into things, trying to figure out what shape this might be, what that might be. There are reports of a cat somewhere around. They may not be reliable, they may be, and so forth and so on. Now, I know this is different than the way most people think about science. Science, we generally are told, is a very well-ordered mechanism for understanding the world, for gaining facts, for gaining data, that it's rule-based, that scientists use this thing called the scientific method, and we've been doing this for 14 generations or so now. And the scientific method is a set of rules for getting hard, cold facts out of the data. I'd like to tell you that's not the case. So there's the scientific method, but what's really going on is this. And it's going on kind of like that. So what is the difference, then, between the way I believe science is pursued and the way it seems to be perceived? So this difference first came to me in some ways in my dual role at Columbia University, where I'm both a professor and run a laboratory in neuroscience, where we try and figure out how the brain works. We do this by studying the sense of smell, the sense of olfaction. And in the laboratory, it's a great pleasure and fascinating work and exciting to work with graduate students and postdocs and think up cool experiments to understand how this sense of smell works and how the brain might be working. And, well, frankly, it's kind of exhilarating. But at the same time, it's my responsibility to teach a large course to undergraduates on the brain. And that's a big subject, and it takes quite a while to organize that. And it's quite challenging, and it's quite interesting. But I have to say, it's not so exhilarating. So what was the difference? Well, the course I was and am teaching is called Cellular and Molecular Neuroscience 1. It's 25 lectures full of all sorts of facts. It uses this giant book called Principles of Neuroscience by 3 famous neuroscientists. This book comes in at 1,414 pages. It weighs a hefty 7.5 pounds. Just to put that in some perspective, that's the weight of 2 normal human brains. So I began to realize by the end of this course that the students maybe were getting the idea that we must know everything there is to know about the brain. That's clearly not true. And they must also have this idea, I suppose, that what scientists do is collect data and collect facts and stick them in these big books. And that's not really the case either. When I go to a meeting, after the meeting day is over and we collect in the bar over a couple of beers with my colleagues, we never talk about what we know. We talk about what we don't know. We talk about what still has to get done, what's so critical to get done in the lab. Indeed, this was, I think, best said by Marie Curie, who said that one never notices what has been done, but only what remains to be done. This was in a letter to her brother after obtaining her 2nd graduate degree, I should say. I have to point out, this has always been one of my favorite pictures of Marie Curie, because I'm convinced that that glow behind her is not a photographic effect. That's the real thing. It is true that her papers are to this day stored in a basement room in the Bibliothèque Française, in a concrete room that's lead-lined. And if you're a scholar and you want access to these notebooks, you have to put on a full radiation hazmat suit, so it's pretty scary business. Nonetheless, this is what I think we were leaving out of our courses, and leaving out of the interaction that we have with the public as scientists, to what remains to be done. This is the stuff that's exhilarating and interesting. It is, if you will, the ignorance. That's what was missing. So I thought, well, maybe I should teach a course on ignorance. Something I can finally excel at, perhaps, for example. So I did start teaching this course on ignorance, and it's been quite interesting, and I'd like to tell you to go to the website. You can find all sorts of information there. It's wide open, and it's been really quite an interesting time for me to meet up with other scientists who come in and talk about what it is they don't know. Now, I use this word ignorance, of course, to be at least in part intentionally provocative, because ignorance has a lot of bad connotations, and I clearly don't mean any of those. So I don't mean stupidity. I don't mean a callow indifference to fact or reason or data. The ignorant are clearly unenlightened, unaware, uninformed, and present company today accepted often occupy elected offices, it seems to me. That's another story, perhaps. I mean a different kind of ignorance. I mean a kind of ignorance that's less pejorative, the kind of ignorance that comes from a communal gap in our knowledge, something that's just not there to be known or isn't known well enough yet or we can't make predictions from. The kind of ignorance that's maybe best summed up in a statement by James Clerk Maxwell, perhaps the greatest physicist between Newton and Einstein, who said, "Thoroughly conscious ignorance is the prelude to every real advance in science." I think it's a wonderful idea, thoroughly conscious ignorance. So that's the kind of ignorance that I want to talk about today. But of course, the first thing we have to clear up is what are we going to do with all those facts? So it is true that science piles up at an alarming rate. We all have this sense that science is this mountain of facts, this accumulation model of science, as many have called it. And it seems impregnable. It seems impossible. How can you ever know all of this? And indeed, the scientific literature grows at an alarming rate. In 2006, there were 1.3 million papers published. There's about a 2.5% yearly growth rate. And so Last year we saw over 1.5 million papers being published. Divide that by the number of minutes in a year, and you wind up with 3 new papers per minute. So I've been up here a little over 10 minutes. I've already lost 3 papers. I have to get out of here, actually. I have to go read. So what do we do about this? Well, the fact is that what scientists do about it is a kind of a controlled neglect, if you will. We just don't worry about it in a way. The facts are important. You have to know a lot of stuff to be a scientist, that's true. But knowing a lot of stuff doesn't make you a scientist. You need to know a lot of stuff to be a lawyer, or an accountant, or an electrician, or a carpenter. But in science, knowing a lot of stuff is not the point. Knowing a lot of stuff is there to help you get to more ignorance. So knowledge is a big subject, but I would say ignorance is a bigger one. So this leads us to maybe think about a little bit about some of the models of science that we tend to use, and I'd like to disabuse you of some of them. So one of them, a popular one, is that scientists are patiently putting the pieces of a puzzle together to reveal some grand scheme or another. This is clearly not true. For one, with puzzles, the manufacturer has guaranteed that there's a solution. We don't have any such guarantee. Indeed, there are many of us who aren't so sure about the manufacturer. So I think the puzzle model doesn't work. Another popular model is that science is busy unraveling things the way you unravel the peels of an onion. So peel by peel, you take away the layers of the onion to get at some fundamental kernel of truth. I don't think that's the way it kind of works either. Another one, a kind of popular one, is the iceberg idea, that we only see the tip of the iceberg, but underneath is where most of the iceberg is hidden. But all of these models are based on the idea of a large body of facts that we can somehow or another get completed. We can chip away at this iceberg and figure out what it is, or we could just wait for it to melt, I suppose, these days. But one way or another, we could get to the whole iceberg, right? Or make it manageable. But I don't think that's the case. I think what really happens in science is a model more like the magic well, where no matter how many buckets you take out, there's always another bucket of water to be had, or my particularly favorite one, with the effect and everything, the ripples on a pond. So if you think of knowledge being this ever-expanding ripple on a pond, the important thing to realize is that our ignorance, the circumference of this knowledge, also grows with knowledge. So that knowledge generates ignorance. This is really well said, I thought, by George Bernard Shaw. This is actually part of a toast that he delivered to celebrate Einstein at a dinner celebrating Einstein's work, in which he claims that science just creates more questions than it answers. I find that kind of glorious, and I think he's precisely right. Plus, it's a kind of job security. As it turns out, he kind of cribbed that from the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who 100 years earlier had come up with this idea of question propagation, that every answer begets more questions. I love that term, question propagation, this idea of questions propagating out there. So I'd say the model we want to take is not that we start out kind of ignorant and we get some facts together and then we gain knowledge. It's rather kind of the other way around, really. What do we use this knowledge for? What are we using this collection of facts for? We're using it to make better ignorance, to come up with, if you will, higher quality ignorance. Because, you know, there's low quality ignorance and there's high quality ignorance. It's not all the same. Scientists argue about this all the time. Sometimes we call them bull sessions, sometimes we call them grant proposals, but nonetheless, that's what the argument is about. It's the ignorance, it's the what we don't know, it's what makes a good question. So how do we think about these questions? I'm going to show you sort of a graph that shows up quite a bit on happy hour posters in various science departments. This graph asks the relationship between what you know and how much you know about it. So what you can know anywhere from nothing to everything, of course, and how much you know about it can be anywhere from a little to a lot. So let's put a point on the graph. There's an undergraduate. Doesn't know much, but they have a lot of interest. They're interested in almost everything. Now you look at a master's student a little further along in their education, and you see they know a bit more, but it's been narrowed somewhat. And finally, you get your PhD, where it turns out you know a tremendous amount about almost nothing. What's really disturbing is the trend line that goes through that. Because, of course, when it dips below the zero axis there, it gets into a negative area. That's where you find people like me, I'm afraid. But the important thing here is that this can all be changed. This whole view can be changed by just changing the label on the x-axis. So instead of how much you know about it, we could say, what can you ask about it? So yes, you do need to know a lot of stuff as a scientist, but the purpose of knowing a lot of stuff is not just to know a lot of stuff. That just makes you a geek, right? Knowing a lot of stuff, the purpose is to be able to ask lots of questions, to be able to frame thoughtful, interesting questions, because that's where the real work is. So let me give you a quick idea of a couple of these sorts of questions. I'm a neuroscientist, so how would we come up with a question in neuroscience? Because it's not always quite so straightforward. So, for example, we could say, well, what is it that the brain does? Well, one thing the brain does moves us around. We walk around on two legs. That seems kind of simple somehow or another. I mean, virtually everybody over 10 months of age kind of walks around on two legs, right? So that maybe is not that interesting. So instead, maybe we want to choose something a little more complicated to look at. How about the visual system? There it is, the visual system. I mean, we love our visual systems. We do all kinds of cool stuff. Indeed, there are over 12,000 neuroscientists who work on the visual system, from the retina to the visual cortex, in an attempt to understand not just the visual system, but to also understand how general principles of how the brain might work. But now here's the thing. Our technology has actually been pretty good at replicating what the visual system does. We have TV, we have movies, we have animation, we have photography, we have pattern recognition, all of these sorts of things. They work differently than our visual systems in some cases, but nonetheless, we've been pretty good at making a technology work like our visual system. Somehow or another, 100 years of robotics, you never saw a robot walk on two legs, because robots don't walk on two legs, because it's not such an easy thing to do. 100 years of robotics, and we can't get a robot that can move more than a couple steps one way or the other. You ask them to go up an inclined plane, and they fall over. Turn around, and they fall over. It's a serious problem. So what is it that's the most difficult thing for a brain to do? What ought we to be studying? Perhaps it ought to be walking on two legs, or the motor system. I'll give you an example from my own lab, my own particularly smelly questions, since we work on the sense of smell. But here's a diagram of 5 molecules in sort of a chemical notation. These are just plain old molecules. But if you snip those molecules up these 2 little holes in the front of your face, you will have in your mind the distinct impression of a rose. If there's a real rose there, those molecules will be the ones. But even if there's no rose there, you'll have a memory of a molecule. How do we turn molecules into perceptions? What's the process by which that could happen? Here's another example. 2 very simple molecules, again, in this kind of chemical notation. Might be easier to visualize than this way. So the gray circles are carbon atoms, the white ones are hydrogen atoms, and the red ones are oxygen atoms. Now, these 2 molecules differ by only 1 carbon atom and 2 little hydrogen atoms that ride along with it. And yet one of them, heptyl acetate, has the distinct odor of a pear. And hexyl acetate is unmistakably banana. So there are 2 really interesting questions here, it seems to me. One is, how can a simple little molecule like that create a perception in your brain that's so clear as a pear or a banana? And secondly, how the hell can we tell the difference between 2 molecules that differ by a single carbon atom? I mean, that's remarkable to me. Clearly the best chemical detector on the face of the planet. You don't even think about it, do you? So, this is a favorite quote of mine that takes us back to the ignorance and the idea of questions. I like to quote because I think dead people shouldn't be excluded from the conversation. And I also think it's important to realize that the conversation's been going on for a while, by the way. So Erwin Schrödinger, a great quantum physicist and I think philosopher, points out how you have to abide by ignorance for an indefinite period of time. And it's this abiding by ignorance that I think we have to learn how to do. This is a tricky thing. This is not such an easy business. I guess it comes down to our education system, so I'm going to talk a little bit about ignorance and education, because I think that's where it really has to play out. So, for one, let's face it, in the age of Google and Wikipedia, the business model of the university and probably secondary schools is simply going to have to change. We just can't sell facts for a living anymore. They're available with a click of the mouse, or if you want to, you could probably just ask the wall one of these days, wherever they're going to hide the things that tell us all this stuff. So what do we have to do? We have to give our students a taste for the boundaries, for what's outside that circumference, for what's outside the facts, what's just beyond the facts. How do we do that? Well, one of the problems, of course, turns out to be testing. We currently have an educational system which is very efficient, but is very efficient at a rather bad thing. So in 2nd grade, all the kids are interested in science, the girls and the boys. They like to take stuff apart, they have great curiosity, they like to investigate things, they go to science museums, they like to play around. They're in 2nd grade. They're interested. But by 11th or 12th grade, fewer than 10% of them have any interest in science whatsoever, let alone a desire to go into science as a career. So we have this remarkably efficient system for beating any interest in science out of everybody's head. Is this what we want? I think this comes from what a teacher colleague of mine calls the bulimic method of education. You know, you can imagine what it is. We just jam a whole bunch of facts down their throats over here, and then they puke it up on an exam over here, and everybody goes home with no added intellectual heft whatsoever. This can't possibly continue to go on. So what do? Well, the geneticists, I have to say, have an interesting maxim they live by. Geneticists always say, you always get what you screen for. And that's meant as a warning. So we always will get what we screen for, and part of what we screen for is in our testing methods. But we hear a lot about testing and evaluation. And we have to think carefully when we're testing whether we're evaluating or whether we're weeding. Whether we're weeding people out, whether we're making some cut. Evaluation is one thing. You hear a lot about evaluation in the literature these days, in the educational literature, but evaluation really amounts to feedback. It amounts to an opportunity for trial and error. It amounts to a chance to work over a longer period of time with this kind of feedback. That's different than weeding, and usually I have to tell you when people talk about evaluation, evaluating students, evaluating teachers, evaluating schools, evaluating programs, that they're really talking about weeding. And that's a bad thing, because then you will get what you select for, which is what we've gotten so far. So I'd say what we need is a test that says, what is X? And the answers are, I don't know, because no one does. Or what's the question, even better? Or, you know what, I'll look it up. I'll ask someone. I'll phone someone. I'll find out. Because that's what we want people to do, and that's how you evaluate them. And maybe for the advanced placement classes, it could be, here's the answer, what's the next question? That's the one I like in particular. So let me end with a quote from William Butler Yeats, who said, education is not about filling buckets, it's lighting fires. So I'd say, let's get out the matches. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so basically, I agree with almost everything he says, and I was thinking maybe I should cut out the evaluation bit of the meeting because you're students and maybe you shouldn't hear that. But rather than that, I decided to talk about something else, and that is, you know, it can be too radical, but I do want to make a small change for a start, and then we'll do it in the following way. So very similar to last year, you'll have an exam at the end of the course. 80% of the grade is the exam. 10% is on your paper presentation, and 10% is on the active participation of being here when we do the discussions and being part of the discussion. And this together will give you 100% of your grade. But if you want to do something else, I give you some other choices, and with them you can kind of save time preparing for the exam. For example, I mean, even there, I think we're trying to make the exam that you saw last year, trying to be less filling out knowledge and facts. It's more about, in my case at least, I'm trying to get papers with figures and see if you can actually analyze the figure and understand what's in it, because that's what it's all about. But nevertheless, I'm going to give bonus to people who are going to show some active, some activity on all kinds of, in all kinds of ways, and there are many ways now to do that. So I'm going to present you some of them, and if you choose to do some of them, just come to me somewhere along the course and talk to me about it. So one way, which I particularly like, is the following. It's a concept called journal club. It exists at least in the Journal of Physiology and also in the Journal of Neuroscience in a little bit different formats. And I'm not sure, but I'm almost sure that there are other journals the idea is that you select a paper that is published within the last 2 months or so, which you find interesting, and then you write a short document, which is 1 page long or something, reviewing, basically highlighting what you find interesting in this paper, and what do you think is like, you can kind of also criticize it, or suggest, what should have been done, or what should be done as the next step. It's kind of a news and views. I don't know if you know the concept. Do you know the concept of news and views? So, okay. So I see I should give you another talk, which is like a very short talk, but that's something that you should know anyway. There's a hierarchy of journals. There are journals that are considered better than others. Better in the sense that more people read them and they have more effect. And if you publish your paper there, usually you're going to have a bigger effect. Usually it's harder to get there as well, but that's a different issue. In these journals, like Nature and Science and Cell, there's a concept where when they find out that there's a paper that they think is even more, stands out of the normal papers, which are already supposed to be very good. They invite usually one of the reviewers of the paper or someone else to write a short paragraph or page to describe what this paper is about and why it is so important. And the reason is that science today is so specific that if you take a journal like Nature, it has sections for physics, for chemistry, for biological sciences. You open the biological sciences, you read the titles, at least like 80% you can't even figure out what they are about, and you are biology. Okay, same thing for physicists. You can't even figure out what they want, because it's very technical, it's very short, these papers are extremely short. And if you're not from the inside field of that paper, you don't know what it is about. But this journal is supposed to be, it comes from like a scholar concept, like from, people like Bertrand Russell, that, a scientist should know everything about everything, and it should be scholar. So there's no point, the point of Nature is that they could publish every one of these papers in a physical journal or in a biological journal. Why do they can't publish it in Nature? And the reason is that because it is supposed to interest every scientist, but not every scientist has an access in order to read and understand them. So some people kind of trying to get you the main point. Why is it important? Why do you have to make the effort to read? So similar concept is been done here. But the main difference here is that they're inviting PhD students and postdocs, not scientists, to write these things. So this is actually directed especially for people like you. Okay, you read the literature, trying to figure out what's important, what's not. You come upon an interesting paper, you can write about it, and it's not only going to count for your credit in the course, it's also going to, you can put it in your CV as a publication. It's not considered as the original publication, but it is a publication, so it's nice. So I urge you to make the effort, either Journal of Physiology, Journal of Neuroscience, or you find out your own. Probably Frontiers have something like that. Another way is blogging. So there are people like that are doing it even anonymously. This guy is anonymous. He has this blog called Neuroskeptic. And in this blog he's taking papers that are published, and he writes short paragraphs analyzing why these papers are either wrong or interesting or stuff like that. So it's another way to do that. You could pick up a subject from our course that you find out that the Wikipedia section on it is missing some stuff, or you can expand it. That's another way. And there's no way to evaluate this thing clearly, but we'll kind of find a way to evaluate how much effort you put into it, what the final result, and how much bonus you're going to gain out of it. Okay, which takes us now to the subject of today, which is the autonomic system. Usually this part is not covered in the course, almost at all, I think. But I thought, it's good to know a little bit about it. Did you hear about it at any kind of context? All of you? No? None of you? Okay. So basically, we have a system it's the peripheral system that in a way controls many processes that happen in the body in an unconscious way. So we don't have a lot of conscious awareness, say, of our blood pressure or any conscious control of our blood pressure. You can gain a little bit of that by, for example, doing biofitness, or if you are a monk, or I don't know, doing some kind of practicing it, you can do that. But generally, many of the processes in our body are going just automatically, and we don't care and we don't think about them. And we don't even think that there are neurons involved. When people talk about digestion, like in high school, they don't ever mention that there are neurons that are controlling, the proportion of food through your stomach and intestine. You kind of think that it happens, but it doesn't. Something controls that. And there are many neurons dedicated to that, which we usually ignore. So this is what we're going to talk a little bit about today. And the other aspect of the system is that sometimes we don't have enough time for conscious control. Some of it is like, when something very frightening happens, or something very threatening happens, you don't have time to actually completely evaluate the situation. You have to act fast. And there are systems in the body that are supposed to do that for you. So we're going to have a break now, I think. Right? Yes, okay. And then we'll talk about that. Yeah, just a second. So, yeah, we'll take a break now, and then we'll talk about the autonomic system. And next week is development, okay? I'm going to take
We have a class on Thursday, right?
what?
We have a class on Thursday.
Yeah, Thursday is going to be the development, but we're going to have another hour now on this.
Right, yeah.
Do you need the charger?
Yeah, sure.
The list, where is the list? People who are not who are coming but doesn't give you?
Yes, one at least who is sick. Sick, I think.
Sorry?
Aran is sick.
Aran?
Oh,
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Is the farm still
No.
Okay.
Is that the time?
I think it was the first day with Wednesday,
No,
but
the
the other meeting.
Nikhil?
Yeah.
בגוגל מאיזה בחינה?
שאני לא רשומה כפונקציות מושגים.
למודל. אוקיי.
כאן יש את כל הדעות שלי על משהו
Yeah, because we can study.
אני לא יודעת איך זה עובד. למה צריך צריכה להירשם
It's like going
כי זה
to
לא
school
בסדר.
on the first day.
תראה, הכי טוב לדבר עם רותי, המזכירה פה. שהיא כאילו אחראית על כל הדברים האלה, אבל היא לא נמצאת שבוע כן, היא יושבת במשרד הכל מצד שמאל. אוקיי, רותי תשמע.
כן, אני משתדלת.
באף אחד מהקורסים או באף אחד אבל זה תמיד היה שם אחרי זה.
בכל הקורסים שזה מרצים מתחלפים, זה היה גם בפיזיולוגיה א' וגם שיטות מחקר, אף פעם לא היה לנו דרך, כמעט אף פעם לא היה.
גם אחרי או רק לפני?
אחרי זה כבר פחות עוזר. כאילו זה עוזר למבחן, אבל...
אתם מדפיסים וכותבים על זה?
אני מסכמת על זה.
במחשב? אוקיי.
זה כאילו מאוד נוח אחר כך.
בסדר. אני אשתדל, לפחות כמו שאני יכול. איפה ההרצאה למלך? כן.
לגבי הפרזנטציות, איך...
אתה לא היית שנה שעברה?
לא.
אוקיי.
מבחינת גם איך... כמה עושים...
אני אסביר את זה.
ראיתי לך באיזשהו שיעור.
לא, באופן עקרוני מה שקורה זה אני לוקח רשימה של מאמרים, כל אחד מקבל מאמר, בדרך כלל לא מהתחום שאם הוא כבר עובד אצל מישהו, אז לא מהתחום שאצלו הוא עובד. ועקרונית כולם אמורים לקרוא את המאמר, ומעשית בדרך כלל לא כולם קוראים אותו, אבל כאילו יש שעה אחת ששני סטודנטים מציגים כל אחד מאמר, זאת אומרת זה משהו כמו 20 דקות בערך. ואחרי זה יש עוד מאמר שאותו כולם אמורים לקרוא. זאת אומרת, כשיש לנו שבוע כזה של הצגת מאמרים, אז יש שני מאמרים. יש מאמר אחד שכולם חייבים לקרוא, ויש מאמר אחד שקורא אם אתה מציג אותו. ואז את המאמר הזה, בדרך כלל מה שאנחנו עושים, זה אני שם אותו על המסך. ואנחנו אומרים פיגר, ואני שואל אנשים כאילו שאלות, ואנחנו מדברים על המאמר. החלק הראשון של ההצגה זה גם בדרך כלל לעבור בדרך כלל על התוצאות של קצת על השיטות. הכי טוב שאני פשוט לא אשים אותך ראשון, ואז אתה תבין איך זה עובד. כי אתה בעצמך כבר יש להם קצת ניסיון.
לגבי הרעיון של הג'ורנל קלאב, אז הרעיון, כאילו הדרך טובה להתחיל פשוט למצוא משהו מעניין כזה לבוא אליך איתו?
כן, למצוא איזה מאמר שיתפרסם. זה לא על רעיון, זה על מאמר.
כן, אני מבין את זה.
לוקח איזשהו, קודם כל להסתכל באתרים של העיתונים האלה מה בדיוק הם דורשים, כי לפעמים, למשל ב-J Neuroscience זה מאמר שהתפרסם רק ב-J Neuroscience. אני חושב שב-J Physiology זה יכול להיות כל מאמר, אני לא בטוח, אני לא זוכר. יכול להיות שהם מתעקשים שזה יהיה מאמרים שהתפרסמו אצלם. רוצים מאמר שכן, שמעניין אותך שיש לך משהו מעניין להגיד עליו. וכן, לא ככה לכתוב את זה. אנחנו לעשות את זה גם בזוגות מבחינתי, אין לי בעיה. going to the course because you present to SFN, you're presenting there? Just to
No,
visit?
but we all get, last year we all could go there just to see the lectures.
Really? And they pay for it?
Yeah.
Really?
Mhm.
For the Israeli one or the Israeli one?
Not the
I
one
thought you
in
talking about in
America.
America.
No, no. In Elat.
The one in Elat. Okay.
Mhm.
Oh, okay, now I understand. Okay. Thank you.
The international one is also called ISSN?
Yeah. I think it's the International Society. Oh no, I think it's just SFN.
אהלן,
היי.
מה העניינים, איך היה?
היה כיף.
כן, על מה מדברים? זה לא קפה.
וואו.
מדהים. בעבר הרחוק, קיבלת רופאים בדינמיקה?
כן.
למדת
דינמיקה?
פרטים?
כן.
כן, ממש סקרנות לקרוא את העבודות שלה לתואר. אחלה. אני פה, אני רב תחום חצי בשבוע, אבל אני פה on and off. יום ראשון בבוקר זה בסדר לך לגוף מיטינג, נכון? לקחתי מערכת מנריקי, אז אני מניחה שזה אותו דבר
כן.
לכולם. סבבה.
ראשון שני אנחנו פשוט אותו דבר.
טוב. קלונינג.
כן.
הוא לא חייב לעשות לו את ה-assignment באותו יום, אפשר לקבוע איתו ליום אחר, אז שאלתי נציגת הסטודנטים מולו, כי אי אפשר שכולם יעבדו מולו, זה לא זה, ולפחות יש איזשהו ניסיון אלטרנטיבי. אז זה יהיה טוב אם תבוא את הוא יהיה כל היום לדעתי, ותכתבי לי מייל מקסימום במהלך היום, ואני אגיד לכם, כי הוא עובד על כל הנקודות כבר, יש לו כמה התקנות לענות על יופי. עברת את הקורס בעלי חיים הזה?
כן.
אפילו ניסים עבר.
נכון זה לכולם. אתה מלמד עכשיו? אוקיי. אתה לא בבית ללחוץ סתם. אני פה עד 11, רבע סורי על התשובות הלא מספקות, אבל
לא טובות, לא, בזה פעם הבאה.
Yeah, but I don't have the notes file. Maybe I'll send you this as an email, and then
Okay. Before we continue, I have 2 or 3 embarrassing questions. Yoni, Yoni and Daniel are always confused who is who. So who is Yoni and who is Daniel? Yoni. Daniel. I thought so, but I wasn't sure. And Nicole. And you're taking it for, you're not an LSAT student, but you're taking it for credit.
I'm just a exchange student.
You are one of the students, okay. And you are Jarvis? Okay. Right, okay, so we can continue. Okay, so we usually, when we talk about the brain, we talk about the, I kind of realize now that, I don't know if you ever had like a talk which kind of presents the brain for you, right? At least when I studied this course, it started with the development of the nervous system, and then it was very clear what is the central nervous system and what the peripheral nervous system and what's like a coronal section and what is horizontal section. I'm not sure if you have a encountered on that. Yeah, but not everybody, some comes from physics and then didn't learn that in undergrad. So if you feel that I'm talking about something that you don't know, just let me know. So central nervous system is the brain and also the spinal cord. It's part of the central nervous system. You know that even the retina is made out of neurons that are considered part of the central nervous system. Okay, it's not periphery. This is very different, for example, from stretch receptors, which are not part of the central nervous system. Okay, the peripheral nervous system is everything that is outside the central nervous system, and it contains the sensory system that we talked about, but also the autonomic system, which is a motor system, okay, which is composed of 2 systems. One is called the sympathetic system, and the other one is a parasympathetic system. Okay, so the sympathetic, just a bit of a hierarchy. The idea is that the motor, the visceral motor system, which is comprised of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic one, are controlling smooth muscles, and this is very different from the motor system that we're going to talk about, which are controlling the skeletal muscles. Okay, and the motor neurons, and we'll talk about it a lot in the other lectures. The motor neurons that's controlling your muscles, the skeletal muscles, the body, the somas of these neurons are located within the spinal cord, and thus are part of the central nervous system. Okay, the axon goes out, but the soma is actually in the spinal cord, and so they are part of the brain. The one that controls the muscles of the smooth muscle, for example, the one that controls the constriction of blood vessels, are located, the soma located outside the spinal cord, and we'll talk about it in a second. This is what makes it a separate system. Okay, so the sympathetic one is the active, is the one that you can think of as the active one, is the one that help you cope with external stimuli during stress, for example. Increase your blood pressure, increase your heart rate, increase your respiratory rate, and stuff like that. Okay, and the other system, the parasympathetic, is actually works to in the opposite direction. So it's more the system of relaxation, if you will. Okay, it's more, it has to do more with maintaining your body at rest. Some people want to, term this in the following. It's like the sympathetic one is a fight or flight system, is the one that kicks you into action before you even understand that you have to do that. Okay? And the other one is rest and digest. Okay, so it's like the relaxation. This okay. So in terms of organization, just to understand how it works,
Just a question.
Yeah.
Both systems are both in the CNS and the PNS?
No, they're both in the PNS. They're not part of the CNS to a degree. Okay, we'll talk about, they have input and they have output towards them to the CNS. And this is exactly what we're talking about now. But the core of these systems are motor neurons that direct action of muscles. Okay? And these motor neurons do not reside in the central nervous system. That's what makes them special or makes them peripheral. Okay, so there are they have communication with the central nervous system, and this is done by these neurons that reside inside the spinal cord, which are called preganglionic neurons. And these neurons are in the spinal cord. I'll show you another way to look at it in a second. They send the axon outside of the spinal cord into a ganglion. A ganglion is usually it's a place where there are many cell bodies of neurons. Okay? So there are ganglions in the body that are not in the spinal cord, and they send the axon there. They synapse on these neurons, and then these neurons, which are motor neurons, are actually sending an axon to either smooth muscles or blood vessels or glands. Okay? Now, these ganglions are organized in a different way in the sympathetic and the parasympathetic neurons. So, for example, this is a cross section of the spinal cord. So you see a neuron which is a somatic motor neuron. These are the neurons that we'll talk about later in the course. And then they send the axon all the way to the muscle, to the skeletal muscle. So, for example, you can have a motor neuron in your spinal cord, and the axon will go all the way to the tip of your toe, okay, and kind of change and control the muscles in your toe. Okay, this could be a meter-long neuron axon. Okay, and next to it there could be another neuron which is a preganglionic neuron. And this neuron actually sends its axon not to the muscle but to this ganglion, And inside these ganglions there is another motor neuron which controls the smooth muscle. Okay? And this would be part of the sympathetic system, and this is the somatic system. It's a completely different system. Okay. Now, in terms of, okay, we don't need to look at that. Okay, so in terms of organization, you know, there's this kind of, I'll tell you something funny about it in a second, but, okay, so if this is the central nervous system and the spinal cord, and these are the three ganglionic neurons, okay, the spinal cord is divided into segments. Okay, we'll talk about it also when we talk about spinal cord, but there are mainly four areas of the spinal cord. And there is a separation between these two systems because the sympathetic system has a chain of ganglia that runs parallel to the spinal cord, outside the spinal cord but parallel to it. And then the neurons from the spinal cord, the preganglionic ones, gets out, go into the ganglions, synapse on a neuron, and then these neurons send the axons to the target organ. Okay, and this could be a very long way. It could go to the heart, to the kidneys, to the eyes, many targets. It's a bit complicated as always, you know, the axon can go out and then go up and to a different ganglion, not the one that is next to it. And then this neuron will send the axon. And one ganglion here can have multiple targets. It can synapse, you know, it can send to the lungs as well as to the heart, for example. Okay. On the other hand, in the sympathetic one, the ganglions are very close to the target organ. So, for example, if you have axons that control the pupil of the eye, the ganglionic sympathetic ganglion would be next to the spinal cord here in this case, okay? But the ganglion of the parasympathetic one will be very close to the eye. Okay, similar in the stomach, and it's similar to almost any location. Okay, so the difference here is that the three ganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic system sends very long axons to the ganglion, and then you have a short connection, and here you have a short connection and then a long connection. Okay, the targets are very similar. The amusing thing about this diagram is that when I looked at it, I found a book in Google Books, from 1975, 5th edition. So in 75 it was already the 5th edition. And the cover of the book, I don't know if you can see, is almost one-to-one. It's like it's one-to-one image of this image from Gonzalez Schwartz. It's like almost amazing. I don't know exactly how that happened. It's not even the same author. So I think this is like one of the feelings that I had, you know, preparing this talk, that this is by large a very neglected system. People kind of feel that just, I don't know, it's not studied very thoroughly under neuroscience today. And when I say today, it's at least for the past 20 years, I think. And I'll try to give you, you know, to convey to you the unease I have with that, in a sense, about it. So largely what I tell you now is almost completely textbook stuff. If you did in this book, if you read this chapter, you'll know everything more or less to the level that I know it. And partially is because it's very hard to find other stuff at all about it. I might be completely wrong about it, but Okay, there is a kind of subdivision of the automatic system called the enteric system, which is the automatic system that controls the gut, and the digestive system, and basically responsible for moving the food through your system. Um, it's located in one ganglion, which is the largest automatic ganglion. It has, I think they say, in the human about 100 million neurons, so it's a pretty big thing. And you tend to, that's what I said before, you tend to think that this is like nothing. Many neurons are involved in this thing. Okay, so another classical aspect of the system is the neurotransmitters. Partially because, first of all, it is important, as you kind of already understand, this system actually keeps you alive. It's very important to understand from pharmacology point of view what's going on there, because many of the drugs that you take and or you should take under some conditions has to do with the system. So the other thing, the other reason that neurotransmitters are associated with this system is because I think some of them were first found, and the receptors, the transmitters, were first identified in the peripheral system before it was done in the CNS. So the classical view, if you just open, classical textbook, are that the preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, okay, on nicotinic receptors. So nicotinic receptors are ionotropic receptors. What it should tell you is that basically when you activate these receptors, you open the receptor as an ion channel, and you polarize the neuron, and it creates excitation. And the postganglionic ones in the sympathetic system are mostly norepinephrine, which act on alpha and beta adrenergic receptors, and these are G protein coupled receptors, so second messenger type of receptors, which means that they are kind of slower to do their stuff. And the parasympathetic ones are working also with acetylcholine, but on muscarinic receptors, which are also slow. Okay, so this is a classical thing. I think physicians that studied in med school up to, I don't know, 15 years ago, probably that's what they know. Apparently this has been okay. So one of the problem, this norepinephrine. This is a system that's responsible to what you kind of feel as an adrenaline rush when you are getting overexcited or go on a roller coaster or something like that. This is what triggers that. Part of the sympathetic system actually targets the adrenal gland, which actually releasing adrenaline throughout the system and not like specifically through the eyes. Okay, but with time, people started to realize that there are much more complicated things going on in this in the autonomic system. One of them is co-transmission, and the other one is co-reception. Now, basically, it's the same thing to some extent. So the idea is that, first of all, in the parasympathetic system, acetylcholine could actually be released, but there would be on the target two types of receptors. Okay, both muscarinic and nicotinic, which means that the response that you will measure from the target cell would be very fast EPSPs from the nicotinic receptors, but sitting on a very, very slow EPSP the muscarinic receptor. Another thing that is happening mostly in the sympathetic system is that you have adrenaline release or norepinephrine release, but you have target receptors both on the target and autoreceptors on the presynaptic terminal. So there could be alpha type adrenergic receptor on the target, and then alpha 2 adrenergic receptors on the presynaptic terminal. And what that can do is what we call depression and facilitation. I don't know if Idan talked to you about it, but the idea is that the next action potential that comes to the terminal will have a different probability of release compared to the first one, because after the first one there will be some receptors here that are bound to receptors, and this could actually either increase the probability of release for the next spike or decrease it. Okay, so you get like a facilitation in terms of if it increases the probability of release, or depression if it decreases the probability of release. Largely, I'll do a subnote here. Largely, when we talk about the CNS, we don't think about these things. We don't think that they exist. I don't know to what level is it kind of hard fact or not, but we usually think of them as single synapse, single receptor, not true single receptor, but at least single transmitter. Receptors, we have, of course, the example of NMDA channels and alpha, and there are other examples for that. GABA subunits could form different type of receptors. So, but co-release is usually not thought as a general mechanism in the central nervous system, but it does here. Okay, the other thing that you have examples of is neurotransmitters co-released together with neuropeptides. So neuropeptides are short amino acid sequences that could also have targets all kinds of receptors, and there are kind of pretty long list of them, neuropeptides Y, VIP, all kinds of substances like that. They could do all kinds of things to the target. Okay, so that's another thing that happens. And in general, they have examples where you have not only target specific of, say, for example, acetylcholine to different receptors, but you also have diffusion of neuropeptides or hormones or other substances to other neurons that are not even being synapses on. So the synapse is between this neuron and that neuron, but the substance that is released from this neuron actually diffuses and have receptors on other neurons. Okay, so you have like also kind of wide range operation. Okay, so we have two systems. One of them is like very active, the other one is very calm. So you understand that they are antagonistic to each other. They don't really work together, but they are autonomic. So what's really happening? So the idea is that there is coordination, and this coordination is done in the central nervous system between the two. Okay, so for example, just as an example, I'll give you this idea of I just want to see what time it is. The baroreceptor reflex, which is what happens if you lie down and you stand up suddenly. So what happens is that you have a sudden drop in your blood pressure. Okay, and then the system has to react fast, because otherwise you won't have any blood in your face. So to increase blood pressure, basically there are two factors that you can do. You can increase the heart rate, and blood vessels, and this will also increase the blood pressure. And these are like clinical tests that you can do to people. You can kind of put them on this table and kind of change its position at different feet and measure the change in blood pressure actually to check if the system works properly. And there is a kind of a feedback loop that is responsible for this, based on the baroreceptors, which are located on the arteries, okay, in the neck and close to the heart, and these are acting like a stretch receptors. So, like we learned in the somatosensory system, if they're stretched, they kind of it creates action potential, and they send that to the midbrain. So, for example, they will be silent if you have a blood pressure of 80, but if it will increase to 100, they will spike more, and if you have a drop, there will be a drop in firing rate. And then the idea is that the system actually kind of take this input from the baroreceptors and compare it to to the set point, and then you have some. So this is like a very simplistic diagram of a feedback system. If you have a change in the input from the receptors, you multiply it by some gain, and this and change the output of the heart and the resistance of the arteries. This will change the blood pressure, and then you actually get and you compare it to the set point, and you kind of have a feedback loop until you get the blood pressure properly. This is, of course, very simplistic way to look at it, and it also looks only on one aspect, which is the sympathetic aspect of the system. If you look around, you can find more sophisticated models of that. Yeah, okay. More sophisticated. We're not going to dive into it, but I thought of, like, before we actually go and see how that is implemented, to have a pause here and just talk to you about control. Because you remember that what this guy was saying is that, like, one of the reasons to study the motor system is because we can get robots to walk more than 2-3 steps before they fall over. And what he has in mind, in a way, is you can think of motor cortex, right? Complicated motor plan. But in fact, what happens is that although in this case it wouldn't be the automatic system that would control, the walking of the robot, because the walking is controlled by skeletal muscles, not by smooth muscles. It is a lot about what we learn about spinal cord. It's more about local control mechanisms that basically release you from the worry of dealing with all these details, right? Because over time you can gain weight and you can lose weight and you can do all kinds of things that happen to your body, and you don't want we're kind of diving a little bit outside, but you don't want to be, when you do a motor plan for how you walk, you don't want to be worried about this stuff. So there are a lot of kind of control mechanisms along the body, and some of them are things like that release you from the worry of having to deal with the details. The problem is that these control systems are extremely complicated, and a lot of them are really understudied. So, for example, one of the kind of the classical case for that is called the FTG. Anyone heard of that before? Okay, so the FTG is a ganglion in the lobster stomach that controls the movement of the stomach. And it has it's basically subdivided into two systems. the the details are not important because we can have actually go through all the details. But there are basically two central pattern generators that are generating types of oscillations like that. Okay? So if you record from some of these neurons, they will spike in a very rhythmic way. Okay? And they kind of different neurons are spiking either in phase or out of phase, and this creates the movement of the muscles of the stomach of the lobster. Now, this has been studied and was very popular over many years as a system. I think that Dimitri did his PhD on that system. It was very popular, and it's only composed of 30 neurons. It's not that many neurons. Okay, but these neurons are interconnected in a very complicated way. They're also connected chemically and electrically. And this is a kind of a list of the substances, the neurotransmitters that are involved in this system. And there are very strange phenomena there that, you take one neuron out and suddenly, the system can regenerate the oscillation, or you change one neurotransmitter and the systems go to a completely different type of oscillatory behavior. And there are maybe still departments that are involved in this in understanding this system. It's only 30 neurons, and we still don't understand it, which makes you think that if you have 100 million neurons that controls all of that, how is that kind of possible to understand on each person? And second is that these are really complicated control systems. It's not like it's certainly not that, right? This is kind of very, very, very naive way to think about it. If you go on a diet and it doesn't work, part of it is because you have like hierarchies of control mechanisms that you really cannot. It's not just like you stop eating and you lose weight. It doesn't work like that. There are all kinds of things that are controlling these things, and they are very complicated. Now, whether you want to choose that for your PhD, yes or no, I don't know. This is subject for a completely different lecture about what's sexy in science and what's not. But a lot of the feeling I often have is that when something is too complicated, you just go you find out something that is more complicated and you just leave it alone. It's not that we lack that because we understand it and we're ready for the next thing. We really don't understand this from any aspect, not from the pharmacology, not from the electrophysiology, not from systems like mathematical models of these systems. And I must tell you that really, really beautiful understanding came out of this very simplistic system. For example, one of the things that I specifically know more about from the system is that it's also a side note, but it's important anyway. So you take a neuron, okay, and this neuron needs to do something like some type of oscillatory behavior. And this is controlled by a group of ion channels, say potassium, calcium, and sodium, that are responsible to make this rhythmic. Now, is there a specific set of ion channels concentration, assuming that the ion channels are doing, every ion channel is exactly the same molecule and doing exactly the same thing? Is there one solution, or are there multiple solutions for that? Can we actually define a model of a neuron like that? That these are identified neurons. Every time you open the ganglion, you'll see exactly know that when you recall from it, it does that. Okay? Is a single set of concentrations of ion channels that needs to be there, and all of these neurons are expressing exactly the same thing. Or could different combinations of ion channels, the same ion channels, but you put a little bit more potassium, a little bit less calcium, you can show that with different combination you get the same behavior. But now if you take different neurons like that each one individually doing the same thing, and you put them as a system, would it work together, yes or no? This is something that, people, it is easy to show that there is not a unique solution per neuron, but it's completely not obvious whether when you take different solutions, do you get different results. And it seems that there are like learning mechanisms that will make the neuron make what it needs to do, like this pattern, okay? But the solution could be different. Okay, so back to our system. So basically, if we go back to the reflex, we don't have much time, and I'm going to miss a lot of modalities. Okay, let's skip that. It's not really interesting. Okay, so basically the system has a hierarchy, which is the key to the automatic system control is a hypothalamus. Okay, and we're going to talk about the hypothalamus a little bit more now. So the hypothalamus is so the hypothalamus is actually located underneath the thalamus. It's a very small region. It's actually composed of many nuclei, and it's involved in controlling a lot of the system, a lot of the things that happens in your bodies. For example, the feeding, the sleep cycle, thermoregulation, stress response, sexual behavior. Many of these things are controlled by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is critical for your maintenance of your body. So if you chop off the whole brain, the cortex, the hippocampus, the thalamus, but you leave the hypothalamus intact, your brain will continue to function. If you take the thalamus out, you will not. Okay, so this is kind of what defines that as the boss of this autonomic system. Okay, what's really amazing is only comprises 4 grams of the total weight of the brain of a human. So it's really small, but it's extremely important. Okay, so it is comprised of many subnuclei, and what it does, what's special about these neurons in these nuclei, is that they actually project to the pituitary gland or the hypophysis gland, where these neurons are special in the fact that they are actually releasing hormones directly to the blood or to other neurons in the pituitary gland, which actually then release different hormones to the blood. So, for example, the hypothalamus is releasing some of these neurons. So there are all these substances that they're releasing. One of them, for example, is the gonadotropin releasing hormone. It's released to the gland, and then it actually controls neurons that's releasing LH or the FSH, which are responsible for ovulation and stuff like that. Okay. Recently, completely contrary to what I told you before about the autonomic system, the hypothalamus became extremely popular recently. Okay, and lots of new PIs that are looking for targets for what they do, they kind of pick a nucleus in the hypothalamus, and this has become the nucleus of choice. And the reason is, I think, I don't know what the reason is, but it looks like, first of all, because it controls things that became suddenly very, very important. So obesity and feeding behavior is controlled by the hypothalamus. Metabolism is controlled by the hypothalamus. Recently, it's been shown that aging is mediated by the thalamus because of all kinds of hormones that are released that are related to aging. Aggression is controlled by the hypothalamus. So suddenly, many things that actually bothering our society at the moment are controlled by the we realize that we knew for ages, like aggression, I think is known for 150 years that it's controlled by the hypothalamus just because of clinical cases where the hypothalamus was injured and people became very aggressive. But recently it became, when I say recently, it's like within the 4 past years or so, it became extremely popular. So I'm going to give you like a very brief, short example from aggression. I listed here 2 other papers that are also related. I don't know if I can do that actually. Okay. I don't have the time that I wanted to show you that. I knew that I will have to give something because of this talk. So I hope we got something out of it. Obviously, one of the reasons it became very popular is optogenetics. Okay, because now, even though the example that I'm going to give you now is not, it is optogenetic, but not for the reason we thought it will be. Okay, this is out of a paper by Lin and David Anderson from 2011. Okay, basically what they did, I'm not going to show you exactly everything they did, but they did a very, very light technical trick. They took a mouse and they put in the cage another mouse, and then if you put an intruder into a mouse cage, and it's not the cage mate, it's not the mouse that it used to be with, and it's a male mouse, it will attack it. Okay? So you can put a mouse, and you can put another mouse in it, and they will fight. Okay? I don't know if you heard already on CFOS, about CFOS? Who's never heard of CFOS? So CFOS is what we call the immediate early gene. So when the neuron spikes a lot, it expresses this gene. Okay, so what they did here is a nice trick where they put the neuron, put the mouse in, let it fight, and then after 45 minutes, put another mouse and it fights again. Okay, and they compare it to a case where it only has, they didn't have the mouse 40 minutes later, only after. Or when it fights and then they put a female and it mates. Okay, so they can compare different behaviors, and the idea is that when so the first stage is that the CFOS is expressed. The second stage is that it leaves the nucleus as a messenger RNA. Okay, and then you can actually stain for these different cases, one for the nuclei and one the nucleus and one outside the nucleus, and you can compare which neurons will express the first, which neurons will express the second, okay? And then when you slice the brain, you can locate places which are, say, only mate, or only fight, or fight mate, or mate fight, and stuff like that, okay? I'm not going to go into the details, you can read it if you want. It's a very, very, this is like kind of staying within the nucleus, this is outside the nucleus, and then you can, outside and inside, and this is outside and inside, plus the inside only, and you kind of compare the proportion of neurons that did that or that. Anyway, when you do that, you can locate a specific region in the hypothalamus. So people could, in rats, for example, trigger aggression by microstimulating in the hypothalamus, but it's very unpredictable. You put the electrode, you don't know where you are, and you don't know exactly what you hit, and sometimes you get aggression, sometimes not. Okay. What they happen to do here is that so they kind of located a specific nucleus, and then they targeted with, first of all, they recorded from neurons, but we're going to jump. They infected this neuron, transfected these neurons with channel adopsin, put fiber optics, see? If you're not following me, just tell me, because I assume that you know what I'm saying. Okay? And this is an example of what happens. So you have a mouse in the cage with this fiber optic. And you put another male intruder. And this is, I think this mouse is anesthetizer. No, actually no. Okay? I think this is actually a better example. No, why is it? I'll show you the better example, which is also something that you can kind of, it's less disturbing. So you have like you have the mouse, you put a glove in, and you kind of, you activate the neurons. So this way it's kind of investigate the glove, you put the light on, you see it tries to attack the glove. So it's pretty amazing.
Did they try the other way around to inhibit that inoculant?
Yeah, so the other part of the paper, we don't have much time to go into that, but they're using a trick which is, it's not optogenetically, it's a more chemical one, but what they do, they express a channel that is inhibitory channel, so it's chloride-based channel, and it's been mutated such that it wouldn't be, it's usually activated by glutamate, it was mutated, so it's not activated by glutamate, but it is activated by a specific substance that you can inject the mouse. And then you do that, and after a few weeks you put an intruder, and it will attack the mouse, but then if you inject the drug and you wait a few hours, you put an intruder and it wouldn't attack the mouse. Okay, and after 8 days or so, if I'm not mistaken, it goes away, and then if you inject again, you get it again. So it's kind of, they kind of pretty nicely shown that this specific sub-nucleus is responsible for aggression. What they didn't show, and this is why I was a little bit kind of, when I read it again, I read it like a few years ago, now when I read it again, I realized that they didn't target the neuron specifically, using some, so it's targeted to this nucleus, but it's not targeted to specific type of neuron. Okay, so this is something that I think this nucleus contains different type of neurons. We still don't understand which neurons are which and which are responsible for what. And they show that recording from these neurons, not from these neurons, but from this nucleus, you have neurons that are responding to mating and neurons that are responding to aggression. And it's different kind of neurons. So there are subpopulations still to be figured out.
At the time when they did it, was it not possible to express channel rhodopsin in a certain type of neurons only?
No, it was, but I think what you don't know, first of all, they didn't know in advance that these are the neurons that are going, so this is like the first step to show that this area is responsible for aggression. But second, I think in order to transfect specific type of neuron, you need markers. So you need to actually go and do some work with these neurons and classify the subtypes, find the promoters that will express in one neuron, not in the other, and I'm sure people are working on that. I don't know what's the state, because it's 2011, so it's not so long ago.
Wouldn't you say so that's stretch to say that this is the region responsible for aggression, but rather just a certain type of aggression?
First of all, yes, of course, it's a certain type of aggression for this specific behavior. And again, of course, it's like, it's more like an output system rather than it's not clear whether this system is doing all the most of it is daily behavior. So, yeah, I completely agree. Um, it's not obvious what triggers that in normal cases, um, but it's a step towards the direction. All right. So next, so on Thursday we meet again. Chaya, I think Chaya will be here, and she will give us an introduction to the development of Physiology. And I'll be in touch with you through Moodle or through email about like having the presentation and the papers and stuff like this. Good.
Right now? Johnson. There?
Huh?
Where's this from?
From downstairs.
Good. Everything
Yeah.
is new, right?
Yeah, I think they just changed the packaging every week,
Okay.
so it looks more independent than it
Yeah.
is.
Good. Alright, I'll tell you more when I
They look good.
a lot. I kept all my accounts.
שאתה משתמש בארדואינואים במעבדה.
How I will put my username and password,
אתה משתמש
and it's in Belgium, and there's like a bin for like
זה גם
yes, yeah,
זה נותן
No, I don't know.
לגבי רובוטיקה וסנסורים בגוף.
Oh, really?
right. We need to
אולי,
talk about. I
אני
mean,
יודע, וכל כך...
you mentioned that.
יש לי גם זה, לא במעבדה, אבל את הלגו מיינדסטורם, שזה גם מאוד נשאר את זה, אבל... אני לא יודע איפה אנחנו עומדים כל כך, אני לא בתחום הזה של רובוטיקה, נראה לי שאנחנו די רחוקים במובנים מסוימים, אתה יודע, יש דברים שרובוטים פה כל כך אנשים. זה להם קצת מאוד ספציפי. אבל כן, זה נותן לך תחושה על כמה זה מסובך.
כן, אבל גם איך זה עובד כרגע, כשיש כל מיני סנסורים של פלייט ושל חיצה.
אז קנית כאילו גם איזה קיט של סנסורים?
אני אחד מתחיל עם זה.
שיש לו כל מיני, כן. יש כאלה קיטים באמזון, אני חושב שאתה
No.
30 סנסורים.
There's only Richard.
Yeah, the interesting device course.
The virus course? So you do the virus course today?
So I was telling you there's something interesting today.
לא. בוא נשאל את הדר. הדר, יש היום משהו אצל מאי?
לא, היא בסוף... בעצם כן. היום כן, ב-10.
10 הערב כבר.
אבל זהו, זה או היום או מחר או ביום ראשון.
זה אותו דבר.
אותו דבר, פשוט התחלפנו בקבוצות. אני לא הייתי בכל הקודמים, אז אני לא ממש יודעת.
אבל מחר זה גם יהיה.
כן.
אבל מחר אנחנו בסמינר, וביום חמישי זה גם יהיה בעצם?
לא, בעצם מחר לא, היא אמרה יום חמישי, אני לא יודעת את השעה, או יום ראשון.
הם כבר התחילו כאן. אבל זה לא הרצאה, זה ממש עבודה.
זה כבר עבודה, כן. כאילו זה המשך של מה שהם התחילו לפני זה. אני גם באה בלי שהם התחילו.
טוב.
I think that's racing method for...
Yeah,